I had to bust my hump. They throw you in the middle of the pond and you swim or you don't. Well, let's just get on with it. And so I kind of Mr. Magoo'd my way through all of these things that others would say are challenges. And a little bit of grit, a little bit of hard work, being coachable, having some discipline. This is just another problem to solve. Before you can criticize something, you might want to become an expert at it. Everyone's got an opinion, but every opinion is not informed.
Top leaders, meaningful conversation, actionable advice, bulldoze complacency, ignite inspiration, create impact. Produced by Southwestern family of companies. This is the Action Catalyst.
Today's guest is Bob Bush, a senior investment executive and the president, CEO, and co-founder of Mutombo Coffee, as well as a longtime advisor to the European Commission, Royal Families, and Dubai Prime Minister, and a contributing writer to Forbes Middle East.
Well, it's great to meet you, Bob, and I'm excited to talk about your most recent endeavors around this. One of the things I really love is exploring the journey to the current destination. When you see someone who's generated, unique success, I feel like your resume, that unique is a good explanation. I'm really excited to dig into it because it's so different than a lot of the experience that people have that have been on the show in the past. So hear a little bit of the journey. Of course, we can talk about the current destination as well.
Yeah, love to do that. I mean, sometimes I think the journey looks more like a vagabond, and other times it's a little bit more purposeful. But in all cases, it's been wonderful.
I love it. So tell me, early days, what were some of your conceptions of what you thought your path was going to be? What track were you on when you were a young person? And then what changed?
Thank you for that question. And I'm not one to really do a lot of reflecting and reflection. I do a lot of introspection, but not a lot of reflecting. And I would say the first journey of any meaning that might be interesting to the listeners is a journey that I took. In fact, my first year of high school, I was born and raised in Southern Illinois. The Mississippi River bifurcates Missouri and Illinois. So I'm on the East St. Louis side, looking at the arch on the St. Louis, Missouri side. And for 4 years, I commuted by bus, often 2 buses, occasionally 3 buses, to get to high school. And so I would say my most significant data point on this journey, as meandering as it's been, is that commute. I'm 13, 14 years old, can't drive yet, needed to get to, I went to a Jesuit boys' school across the river, very fine school in St. Louis. That commute and I was undersized, I was a bespectacled kid, I was a geeky kid. My book bag weighed almost as much as I did. So those images of these little kids with their backpacks and stuff. And so I'm kind of dragging my pounds of books to classes every day. Just the interaction with the public, right? The lady who's, at 6:30 a.m., she's just finished her shift. Or maybe the guy who just finished his midnight shift. And then there's the lady who's on her way to work because she's, working as a baker, and all of these different sort of types of people as I'm making my way to school. And I wasn't scared or intimidated at all about it. But I'm like, how did my parents allow me to do that? Right. And they said they were scared, but I wanted to go to a good school. I enjoyed the challenge of that. And I wasn't bothered by the 2+ hour commute. I was up at 5:30, whatever. I got going. I was sitting at my desk by 8 for those 4 years. So that was the first journey. And I remember thinking as I would go back and forth, either going towards the arch or away from the arch, it was a tale of 2 cities. And I actually wrote about that for my entrance exams for college. How is it that such a short piece of river that's less than a mile wide, the difference could be so grand and so great? And so I'm leaving what would be called the inner city of East St. Louis, going into this beautiful campus with very bright kids that had come from the St. Louis side. I'm sitting behind people whose parents own some of the biggest companies in the Midwest, certainly in St. Louis, sports teams and engineering companies and law firms. And that tale of 2 cities was very stark. But I learned through my classmates, et cetera, that there was much more we had in common than not.
Oh, that's really extraordinary. And, I think you get into a different environment. And what I heard in your story that actually made me want to ask another question first is, it sounded like you said you made this choice that you wanted to go to this school.
Yeah. And I can tell you, it's tough to make any young teenager or kid, at a certain point do anything. It's just almost impossible. So one of the things that my parents did is allow you to make choices, allow you to fail a little bit, but not too much. A skinned knee is okay. Maybe a broken arm is okay for some parents, but let's not lose a limb, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was truly a choice to go because I had a fire and an appetite I was very intellectually curious. And unfortunately, the programs and the schools that were sort of the easy commute were going to meet my academic interests. And so I had to, there were two schools that across on the St. Louis side that were considered nationally ranked and world class. I didn't know what the Ivy League was called and all that stuff then. I just knew that I had showed a little bit of aptitude and I wanted to be around, an intense sort of learning environment. And so it was 100% my choice that my parents supported. The tuition was quite expensive. I sometimes worked after school and it taught me discipline, but it was a wonderful academic setting. So it certainly was my choice, and it was a choice that really put me on a very firm footing as I went to other steps in that journey.
Yeah. Well, you take out any part of the rest of your story and you already have, a predictive amount of success that, is coming out of a young teenager. Because the other thing I do know about teenagers is that they're not typically very inspired to work extra hard.
Unbelievable.
So to actively make the choice for academic rigor and to get on a bus of strangers to get down there says just a lot about the kind of character you had.
Two buses, sometimes three, but it was fun. Learning was fun. Learning is still fun. I'm still hyper curious. So it wasn't, I didn't consider it rigorous or challenging. It was just kind of a natural thing. So I guess I've been blessed in that way.
So take that observation and then move that forward through college to your entry into the professional world, like the things that just occurred naturally to you. Yeah, okay, I'll take 3 buses to get to a school that's academically rigorous that I can learn from. Of course, that makes sense. How did that interplay into your early career as a professional?
Oh boy, so lots. And so I'll tell you a story. I was a philosophy major, went to a small college, Amherst College, about 1,600 kids. In fact, my college was about the same size as my high school. And I chose there because it was one of the toughest colleges to get into. I'd never been to Boston, certainly not to Amherst. And we went and looked at the big, Ivy League schools. And I fell in love with the little college setting and studied philosophy and English literature, read Latin and Greek. And so I'm around looking at all what my friends are doing and classmates, and they're going to Wall Street, they're going to consulting firms, they're getting their MBAs. And so wanted to learn more about that. But mind you, I hadn't studied finance or any of that stuff, but I applied to Wall Street because that's where my friends were going. And I heard you could make a lot of money doing it. And much to my surprise, he said, what does a philosopher have to do with making money on Wall Street? And I said, well, I don't know, but I did pretty well in school. If I don't have the same answer that all the other kids give you, I bet I'll give you an interesting one. So they said, okay, you young whippersnapper, we're going to put you in sales. And I said, no, I want to be in mergers and acquisitions. And they're like, you've got to be kidding. The M&A guys, they're the masters of the universe. Like, you got to have a very strong economic and maybe physics or certainly math grounding, etc., finance grounding. What do we do with you there? And I said, well, I'll learn it. Give me a chance. And so I talked my way into being a financial analyst at a major Wall Street firm. And they kicked my butt because I didn't know nothing. 80-hour weeks, 90-hour weeks, some 100-hour weeks. And I was put on the largest leveraged buyout in the history of finance, RJR Nabisco. And I was one of the analysts on that deal. And so I went from studying philosophy to doing high stakes, large buyouts as an analyst. And I had to make up for what I didn't know. But I'm quite competitive and I enjoyed learning it. And I was a geek, so I didn't mind if I missed social activities and stuff. I was sort of single-minded about learning this craft, but I had to bust my hump. And then occasionally I was hazed and all of that. And that's just part of it. There were not a lot of African Americans on Wall Street doing that kind of work at all. And so the notion of having a mentor or having the support system, they throw you in the middle of the pond and you swim or you don't. And I just sort of, well, let's just get on with it. And so I kind of Mr. Magoo'd my way through all of these things that others would say are challenges. And because by the grace of God, I've always landed on my feet.
Yeah. With that analyst role, you being as curious as you are, like what were a couple of key observations that you made as an analyst that said, I can make a career out of this thing?
I'm not so sure, because now looking on hindsight, I don't want to appear to be smarter than I was then. But certainly, so there's the observations I was making in real time, of course. And then there's the looking back 40 years observations. And so I don't want to sort of conflate them, but it's kind of difficult to couple them. But sort of one of the things that is a thread from my experience in high school and the experience I had being in another pulled environment with financial analysts and these Wall Street bankers and stuff is that there really isn't that much difference. A little bit of grit, a little bit of hard work, being coachable, having some discipline. It's all the same kind of stuff. So one observation was whatever the challenge happened to be, despite the fact I didn't sort of walk in with the same sort of skill set, what I did have from my liberal arts background and my philosophy background was very helpful. I got some fundamental understanding of how to approach a problem, how to solve a problem, how to think through a problem, thinking about methods and processes, etc. And so I realized that why I navigated the philosophy in the first place, because I'm not particularly intimidated by chaos or mess or data that doesn't seem to align. I have a bit of a natural ability, thank goodness, but some training to go into whether it's any field, I think, and through a little bit of hard work, sort myself out. And so I think that was one of the key observations, is that this is just another problem to solve.
Beautiful. Philosophy is a lot of things, but there are a lot of rubrics for problem solving baked into philosophy. And I feel like so much of navigating business and growing business is a matter of untying the knots and solving the problems that are both inside and inside the business and the big problems that are the business is designed to solve for everyone else.
That's right. Well, the biggest knot, right? It's the people problem knot. That's the biggest knot.
People are your biggest problem and your greatest asset. So how do you get, just help us skip over to this component, your role as a senior investment executive took you to a lot of different geographies. I mean, well outside of the US. What drove you in that direction? Or maybe it wasn't your choice?
Well, another sort of dot on this journey, we had a friend in undergrad whose sister lived in Dubai in the early 90s. And she was very cute and he was very cool. And he says, I'm going to visit my sister. As she lives in Dubai. I said, I'll come along. Never been to Dubai. And so we went to the desert and I hung out with Kareem and spent some time with him and his family, etc. So my first travel to Dubai was personal one and just for fun. And while I was there, I was talking to a gentleman who was a Bedouin and he was dressed in local garb. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm on vacation. And he started laughing, right? This is the early 90s. So he's chuckling, well, what are you doing on vacation? I said, well, I've never been. And my friend is here. So we started chatting. And he said something to me very profound. He said, we don't need you here. And I said, what do you mean? He says, we can send our kids all over the world to your schools. So if you ever want to come back and you want to do something here, it's not what you know. It's not your learning. It's how you communicate and whether you understand my culture and you can communicate with me. And he literally took his hand and he moved it from his head to his heart. You make the head heart connection, and I would love to have you back. But if you think you're going to go and you're with your fancy schools to come back and teach us something or help us with something, don't need you for that. And I really thought about that because I was contemplating going to business school and doing more finance, etc. And I shifted to go to study international relations Arabic at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So rather than getting a traditional finance degree, I went and started language skills, economics, cultural orientations in Washington, D.C. That actually helped orientate me to, this is not about just the dollars and the cents. There are people behind this, right? There's the famous phrase that pilots don't fly planes, they fly people. And so if you really want to get behind the numbers, you got to understand what those numbers represent.
Yeah, it's not just about recording the data, it's how your ability to interpret it that really makes a difference, right? And kind of makes or breaks someone's ability, career path in that area. I can see that. And I think the international component, it must have been such a good learning experience in and of itself to travel, like you gave in that great anecdote, meet with people and break down different barriers that we all have in our own mind and perceptions of the world around us. So this brought you to your experience with, private equity, venture capital. In the experience that you had and where that led you, what were some of the bigger transactions that you were a part of that provided significant lessons for you?
Right. And so the role that venture can play in capital formation and economic development, the role that PE plays. I've had the good fortune of, I moved to Dubai in the early 2000s to work. I was an advisor to the Prime Minister of the UAE and the ruler of Dubai to talk about how to make Dubai a viable and sustainable emirate that was world class and what kind of services could be offered. And I was a small part of a great team that helped develop the economic development strategy of a wonderful emirate and a wonderful country. And so using the traditional tools of M&A and financial structuring and engineering and understanding optionality and all these things to bring it into a very practical way of helping to develop a country, develop a region. Fabulous. I was headhunted for the role, and they wanted someone that had this curious admixture of skills and experiences. So the random guy I meet in Dubai is why I studied the Middle East and Africa. Because I'd done finance, I had the finance. I had worked in worked in a couple of fintech companies before it was called fintech, around capital formation. Because while I was in graduate school, I finally did go to graduate school. I received a fellowship to travel through Africa, and I backpacked through Africa for almost a year, visiting capital cities. And one of the first place I landed was in Accra, Ghana, because Accra had just launched its equity exchange. And trying to understand how capital formation could have an impact on the development of Ghana, the country, all these little bits. And I didn't know sort of where these were going to go, but was headhunted. It's like, well, you've got the entrepreneurial bit, you've got the economic development bit, you know about the region, you got financial training, you seem to be able to get acculturated pretty quickly. Would you come from New York and work with us here in Dubai? And I remember telling some of my friends, and they were one funny story is one of my friends said, Bob, this is money making Manhattan. What are you going to go do in the desert? And I said, I don't know, but they're saying all this crazy stuff. If they can do half of it, this is going to be a very interesting journey. And if it doesn't work out, I can always come back to the US. Now, fortunately, not married, no kids, right? I didn't have those tethers. So that's how I ended up moving to Dubai in 2003 and then working on what has to be considered one of the most amazing formations, country formations, immigrant formations in the last 100 plus years of what they did in what was a desert into now a top 10 global destination.
No kidding. Had to be on the ground floor to experience that. So there's a stereotype, Bob, that maybe isn't completely pervasive, but that folks who choose private equity and venture and these things that, they don't really care about social impact. But this isn't obviously a true stereotype. There's many that are involved, including yourself. And so what, you obviously took a slightly unconventional path to get into the path that you did through philosophy undergrad, so you've already were outside the box. But what led you down the path of creating social impact, and how has business helped with that?
Yeah, I think you can sort of see the dots, right? So before you can criticize something, you might want to become an expert at it. Everyone's got an opinion, but every opinion is not informed. And so just starting with what does social impact mean, right? That's environmental sustainability, that's financial sustainability, right? That's that, those elements have some type of capital component, and whether that capital is relational capital or social capital or financial capital. I just see PE or finance is just one of the tools that is necessary to creating impact. And that social impact is financial impact. That social impact is economic impact. That social impact is environmental impact, et cetera. And so getting some proper training and then working in an emirate and with other governments to sort of figure out how we can take these traditional access to capital issues, access to market issues, and create business models around them. To me, this is a culmination of all of those other things that I've done to see if I can take what, to your point, are skills or one type of impact, shareholder ROI, and see how you can, if you have any kind of facility, right? And one of the challenges that the world of Silicon Valley has and the world of Wall Street have is what kinds of questions are you asking? You ask the kind of question about the kind of problem you want to solve, and then the money goes to that. And you can, do we really need flying cars? But if that's the question, you can come out with a viable business model. There'll be someone that'll help you fund flying cars. Absolutely, to your point of sort of coming from the outside, whether that's the outsider having to commute to go to St. Louis for school. I've always had the blessing of being able to look at something a little bit more broadly than most. And I applied that natural instinct and these traditional skills to go, can I take this totality of all these other experiences that I've used in some perhaps traditional ways and bring those skills into something by asking different questions and hopefully getting better output. And I remember one of the first images that I ever had that gave me a global perspective. And my father and mother still have it. There was an African boy who was skeletal, could not have been more than 6 or 7 years old, eating from a bowl that had a few pieces of rice. And I remember asking then, and I still ask today, why does that have to exist in our world with so much surplus? That's a question that I had as a little boy, and a version of that question I still ask myself as we now are dealing much more focused on the agriculture and coffee and cocoa and these things. So it may look like it's this sort of circuitous, strange path, journey to get into social impact. But I think in the way we define social impact, right, we're not a charity. Commerce. Can we use commerce over charity? My partner, may he rest in peace, has a very viable foundation that has done a lot of foundational work and has given millions of dollars in education and healthcare. It's a nonprofit. When we started this, he and I said, we want this to be a social enterprise that needs to use the same metrics of operational efficiency and capital efficiency as any other business, because that's viability. And we're going to use this model and the things that we've learned. So, sir, you are the passion and I'm the purpose. And together we're going to see if we can ask some good questions to have some impact.
I love it. I remember as a 20-something-year-old having an early midlife crisis, very early midlife crisis, where I was thinking about what's the purpose of life, what's the impact I want to have, and that kind of led me to like, what's the problem I want to solve? And I thought, wow, there's so many problems to solve, so I should probably be in politics, and I'd studied government and politics as a result. And there was a point where I just shut myself in my room for a couple of days to just really write out all the things that were in my brain and to process where I wanted to go. And, looking back on my studies, studying government politics at University of Maryland actually led me to this belief that being a politician actually is quite limited in the type of impact that you can have. And that's true and not true, probably. But I came to a personal conclusion that one of the biggest challenges are the people, which is what we started. People are the biggest problem, the greatest asset, right? And I thought to myself, if we could change or impact education and maybe even in unconventional ways, we could help young people develop a higher EQ, some of the things that are not taught in schools, but how we manage our emotions so that their emotions can't be hijacked by others, that they could have more self-confidence and self-value, that they could reverse engineer their goals. I mean, these things that had helped me have a transformative experience in my life, that maybe that was the best place of impact. And that led to a career of coaching and development and building a business that does the same. And so I hear your story, and I think I agree with you that a big part of life is making sure we're solving the most important problems. And everybody's got a different perspective on that. But we have some brilliant people in this world that are chasing relatively silly problems to solve, or in some cases, brilliant people that choose maybe to just be important in this world instead of being of value. What I hear you doing is being of value. And so what are the biggest problems that you think are worth solving?
Wow, man. Like, how long is this show? My goodness. First, thank you for that, your own reflection. And I love how you summed it up. There are people in the world that choose to be more important instead of being more valuable. And it kind of links to the conversation that we had a little bit earlier about understanding valuation, mergers and acquisitions, the valuation, the value to value an asset, and understanding the values of an asset, right? And as much as people can be a problem with regards to efficiency and getting things done, that the values have to be distinguishable from the dollar value. And this is a way that when I'm sort of approaching a problem, I'm very mindful of what are we measuring? How do we measure it? And is this going to be a values-driven metric, or is this a valuation-driven metric? And they're both important when you're talking about creating a sustainable model. And so, to get to your question about what kinds of problems to solve, every problem at some point has this tension. Are we thinking short-term, or are we thinking long-term? Or whether it's healthcare, there's a cost-benefit analysis. Well, if we can get the vaccine out 6 months earlier, it is going to have X percentage of people that it can help, but Y percentage of the people are not going to be helped because there's maybe some additional things that we can do. There's always contraindications, right? There's always risks. There's always the obverse side of that coin. And so to me, it's not so much which problem is more or less important. It is how do you tackle whatever problem you're doing, right? Because I don't want your listeners, and I certainly don't think this way, to think that big problems, major problems, my problem is I'm trying to save the world from malaria. There are problems in your neighborhood. There are problems in your school. The question is the mindset around it. So let's not think about it in terms of big problems or little problems. It is whatever problem that is before you, bring an interdisciplinary, bring a diverse, bring a viable, bring a perspective, a mindset, recognizing that value and values are not the same thing.
Yeah. Well done. I think it's a great perspective. Big problems are important to solve, but at the same time, they don't have to be hairy and audacious and worldwide. In fact, we need a lot more people solving the local problem that adds up to a big solution. And it's really about having a problem solving mindset and how to tackle them.
That's right.
And stay tuned. We'll continue this conversation with Bob in episode 486 of The Action Catalyst.
If you enjoy this podcast, please make sure to subscribe. And to stay updated on everything that the Action Catalyst is up to, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Action Catalyst Podcast and on Twitter at Catalyst_Action. And thanks for listening.